So just there are lots of understood reasons now why execs should be using their voice in digital spaces like social media, building authentic connections, enhancing brand visibility, establishing their thought leadership, which they're always kind of keen to do, making sure the information that's out there about you is correct, which is a growing thing, getting feedback from your key stakeholder base, and humanizing the leadership of the brand overall. Are they doing it though? Are they succeeding with that? And are they picking one or two of these that they think are more important? What's the status?
Yeah, like so many things, there's a wide spectrum. I mean, we know that a majority of C-suite and senior leaders are on social now in 2024, although that maybe wasn't the case 5-6 years ago. So that's the progress has been made in terms of just them joining the party. Now, how they're leveraging those tools is another broader conversation. So there's definitely some that are still sort of spending time using those tools in more of a traditional PR methodology, right? So sharing out, a synopsis of earnings calls, perhaps a shorter version of a press release about a product launch. I think that's fine, but I don't necessarily believe that that's leveraging the community aspect and the immediate feedback and dialogue that you get on social properties to its fullest extent.
So what I'm hearing there is they've dipped their toes into the water, but they ain't swimming yet. They're still kind of playing it safe, the way execs are wont to do.
Definitely the majority are. There are some notable exceptions. I brought two with me just as examples if you'd like to hear.
Yeah.
So one on LinkedIn, Frank Cooper. So he's the CMO, Chief Marketing Officer of Visa. And I think he does a great job. He's got a really diverse, interesting background. He worked for Def Jam Records, Pepsi. So he's got a big, deep interest in music and pop culture. And he weaves that into his personal interests and those things into a lot of his content. And then at times ties it to Visa, but at other times it's not. It's just sort of his interest in those things. He also does some fun stuff around kind of video and like charting out a day in the life as he's traveling, say, to China or other markets, right?
So behind the scenes kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I think he uses video well. He uses his personal interests outside of work well to kind of paint a fuller picture of who Frank is besides just the CMO of Visa.
Love it. Who's the other one?
The other one that I like a lot is very prominent on Instagram. So Sarah Blakely. So she's the founder of Spanx, and I believe the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. Now she has a new company that's a shoe line called Sneaks. But regardless of the product she's selling, she just uses Instagram, again, in a very human kind of like flaws and all way. She'll show herself in the backyard, having just a conversation around their swimming pool with like her dad and her husband's friends, and they're just in regular clothes talking about things, reminiscing of trips they've taken or lessons they've learned. She has a kind of a famous coffee cup sort of photo series where she holds up the coffee cup with quotes on it. Anyway, I feel like she shows herself learning and trying and making mistakes in ways that many CEOs, especially at that level, won't necessarily do.
There's some really good examples there. So I don't need to be Elon Musk and kind of pushing the envelope and deliberately trying to get, sometimes, because I actually like Elon, but deliberately trying to get on people's nerves. I can just be me and show people behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah, I think being controversial and edgy is certainly one way to get attention, to get, engagement. But like I'm sure you know well, so much of it is just about who you are. And if your personality perhaps is already someone who's kind of edgy and controversial, that's who you are. So show it. If your personality is something different, let that come through and be that human.
You gave two examples there, and you specifically said Frank Cooper on LinkedIn and the second one on Sarah Blakely. I think I said that right. On Instagram. They've chosen their channels deliberately, and I'll call it broadcast, but it's not really broadcast. They publish materials specific to those channels. LinkedIn, perhaps more want for telling stories. Instagram is really a video slash photo album that you're kind of displaying at the same time that has some abilities. How do I decide which channel is right for me? And it's not a matter of just spraying all the channels and hoping I connect on all of them.
Great question. There's no perfect answer, but the first place I go, and often where I would guide my clients, would be, where do you believe that your target audience is spending the most time? So, for example, for my business, I'm really targeting and hoping to work with partners and clients that are at a very senior level in their profession. And I don't mean to say that they aren't on Instagram, for example, but they probably are using Instagram maybe for more personal reasons.
They're scrolling.
They're scrolling, right? Or they're sharing photos of their family or trips, what have you. And that's great. But part of me doesn't want to interrupt that. Like, that's sort of their space. So I lean in on LinkedIn from a social perspective, because I truly believe that is where a lot of my audience is spending time and where I perhaps can get a little bit more of their attention from a business perspective.
Love it. I was on LinkedIn yesterday, and I'm lucky. I am connected to, and I follow lots of great executives. Some I've worked with, some have just caught my eye, and I like to follow. But let me read you a sampling of what I read literally the other day. Number one, I'm happy to share I've obtained a new certification, such and such certification from the Ivy Academy at Ivy Business School. Number two, today we're thrilled to announce company's name, latest partner name. And number three, I'm very fortunate to work with such a great team at company name to provide customer and communities with description of our service. Thank you, name of municipality, and our industry partners for such a warm welcome. I'm going to go so far as to say I did not hear one authentic word or a word with personality that's in there. They are playing it ultra safe. How would you, if any of those caught your eye, how would you tweak them? How would you advise these executives on how to make a realer connection?
Yeah. You bring up such a good point. There, again, it's funny. It's like, we're happy that senior leaders and influencers and sort of executives at the highest level have joined that party. We're happy that they're there, right? Because we're there. Yeah. But we want them to be more full, right? More well-rounded, and maybe allow some of the edges to show once in a while. So, and I understand it takes courage. I mean, it can be very scary, especially when you're looking after multiple, like tens of thousands of people. If it's a publicly traded company, there's a lot of risk with what you say in terms of moving the stock price or altering, relationships with customers. So I get that there's risk, but I believe that any of those lines that you just shared could be altered by first asking, how is this of service to my audience? And I believe that if you come at, and this isn't just social, this could be in a podcast format, could be up on stage if you're doing a keynote. Yeah, that if you start with what is it that I want the audience to feel or think or walk away remembering? And how is that either entertaining? How is it emotional? How is it useful and practical? If you start first kind of with the beginning with the end in mind, and then you reverse engineer your way out of that in terms of what you're going to write or say, I believe that is much more resonant with whoever is reading what you posted.
That is so spot on. You need to tap into the emotions of some kind, humor, for some anger, right? That's how folks like Elon Musk and Donald Trump and I'm sure others on the Democrat side have done it through promoting anger, things like that, agitating. Mark Cuban does that quite a bit. And the other channels that you talked about, because the reality of social media is we are spending a ton of time. I think it's 80%. 80% of us are on a social media channel of some kind, and we spend 2.5 hours a day statistically. But the reality is we're soaking up very little. We're scrolling like mindless drones, and social media engagement is continually in decline. So those other channels, you mentioned podcasting, which I love, but YouTube, right? And newsletters. What are some of the different ways, email blasts, what are some of the different ways that executives can make that personal connection and not just on boring old social media?
Yeah, right. It feels like social is
It's
kind
getting
of in that-
old.
right. Yeah, it's been around now for 20 years. Isn't that crazy to think?
Yeah.
So you said it really well before we were chatting, before we got on, and I loved the way that you framed it. You know, social can go broad, but it's fairly shallow in most cases, right?
Because I don't
Unless you're
spend much time with it.
right, unless it's someone that you're really interested in, or their content is really sticky, right? For the most part, it's shallow.
Like, and then I move on.
Yep, but you can hit a wide range of people. However, podcasting, which is almost the reverse, is perhaps a little bit more niche, although I know you know this, but now we've got like 40% of Americans, and probably beyond, that are tuning in once a month to podcasts. So it's finally, even though it's been around again for 20 years, it's finally penetrating, I think, at a little bit bigger than a niche. But it still is niche versus social, but we go so much deeper. Like this conversation today, we're going to spend 25 minutes talking. And if someone even listens to half of that, 10 minutes is far more than they would spend on a single social post.
Amen. So how do I decide which route I want to go? It's great if they're going to listen to me for 10, 20 minutes, but then I got to put all that thought into what I'm going to do to be entertaining or informative across that 10, 20 minutes. Should I go the YouTube route? The challenge with video is an enormous resource to put together a good video. Or do I start a weekly or daily newsletter that I blast out? How do I decide which one?
Yeah. I mean, and I'm facing this right now with my own business, right?
Yeah.
How do I best allocate the hours I have in each day? And I'm sure you can relate to this. Yeah. So my belief, again, this is the same way I'd advise my clients, and the advice I'd give myself is that start with one thing. Start with something that you already feel comfortable with and get good at that, get a cadence, get an editorial strategy, right? Build a rhythm around that. And you're obviously fine tuning and iterating as you get feedback. And then as that kind of gets going, add perhaps a second medium, right? And then again, a third. But this doesn't need to happen in weeks. It can happen in months. I would actually suggest that you do one thing really well before you add another versus a term I use a lot, which is peanut butter yourself, right? Across multiple mediums all at once, but you're doing everything at kind of a 50 or 60% quality. I would rather just start with one. So, I know we've talked about this, but I'll just maybe double click on it. The way that I look at social and podcasting, just to start with those two, is they're incredibly complementary, right? Like we're just saying, social is a bit wider, but more shallow, and we spend a little bit less time with it. Podcasting is a little bit more narrow, but deep. So we spend more time with it. But besides that, social, if you think about it, is generally very visual, whether it's imagery, video, or copy, right? You're using your eyes to consume it for the most part. There's, of course, video that has audio, but generally it's visual. Podcasting, of course, is auditory, right? So it's tapping into a different sense. And in many ways, I believe podcasting is much more personal.
Agreed, by the way. Agreed.
Yes. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I listen to a tremendous amount of podcasts. I've been a big podcast listener for years. It's where I get much of my news. It's where I hear a lot of deeper dive interviews. I learn so much through podcasting. But I feel like number one, it is the human voice. And again, it's longer form. So you're hearing a more conversational, sort of casual tone, which that feels personal for many of us. And then number two, it's quite literally in your ear. So it just feels kind of closer to your body, if you will. And I think there's something kind of visceral about it being in your ear that is really special and unique.
There is actually science to that because it's physically in your ear, your auditory cortex interprets it slightly differently, and it makes a stronger implant on your brain. And just to add to that, the value of audio is it gives you the 25th hour in your day. Because right now, the person listening is doing the dishes. They're on the Peloton. They're going for their nightly walk. They're commuting to or from work, right? So they're not creating a habit for us. We're fitting into their existing habit. And
great, well said.
That's where audio works. And video is working more and more these days too. Okay, I want to circle back to for the executive that's listening, because they hear all this: be authentic, be yourself. Yes, 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 I get it. And it's hard though. They feel very vulnerable because CEOs, they have bosses. They're called members of the board. And if they go out there and they act like Elon Musk, they're not Elon Musk. They don't have $1 billion. A lot of CEOs, yes, they make excellent salaries, $1 million, $5 million, $10 million, but that's the golden goose for them. They ain't estranging the golden goose, so they come off, because they feel vulnerable, they come off more staid, more cautious. And I would agree they don't just want to be themselves. There has to be a modicum of professionality to it. Tell me about executives you've worked with where that's the challenge. Yes, be yourself, be authentic, but at the same time, just unbutton the shirt. Don't take the shirt off, if I can use that phrase.
Yes, that's a good analogy. I like that. So what you're sort of explaining is the idea behind having a narrative framework. And that's like fancy language, right? But really it's, hey, what are call it 3 areas that I want to repeatedly touch on in my content? And that content, again, like we just talked about, can show up in social, whichever platform you've chosen. It can show up in podcasting, can show up in email, as you mentioned earlier, which again is a really lovely space that's kind of a third leg of that stool because you own it, right? You own the people that receive that email, which is really different than kind of renting space, which is what we do in a lot of other digital properties. So whatever medium you're choosing, if you have a narrative platform that, say, touches on, I want to talk about, new news, partnerships, product launches, kind of a lot of the traditional things, but really important moments in time for my company. Check. Maybe that's one. A second could be, I really want to highlight and lift up, right? Shine a light on others, right? Whether it's employees, my team, people that I've met when I travel around the world, different cultures. I want to sort of shine a light on interesting people and achievements that they've made, and my support behind that, for example. And then a third maybe is a little bit more of sort of your vision for the future and whatever the industry might be. So your knowledge and all of your experience, all of your relationships accrue to you having perhaps an instinct about where you think an industry might be in 5 or 10 years. Maybe you talk about your predictions. You talk about where you see things evolving. Those are just 3 examples. But if you've got an architecture or a narrative platform, and then you use that, again, consistently across these different channels, you're going to come across as a much more well-rounded and interesting executive, yet still professional.
Well said. And hire a co-pilot for the journey. Talk to a professional to help weave your way through this. Really appreciate your time today, Jess.
Thank you. It's been lovely.